It's no surprise to anybody that our churches are experiencing a breakdown in generational continuity. Just like in the Old Testament, in the story of the books of Joshua and Judges, that transition following Joshua's period of leadership, his death, the death of that generation of elders just below him. By that third generation, we learn from Judges chapter 1 through 3. By that third generation, a knowledge of God was gone, and the people were worshiping pagan idols, and they were embracing the law and the religion of the land. All through the Bible, you see this type of generational breakdown. And today, we hear all the time how the church is suffering something very similar. Something like 80+% of our youth, once they graduate high school, leave the church and never come back. Much can be said about that diagnostically as to the church's contribution, but I'd like to focus in a series of posts on family worship on the family's contribution to this type of a breakdown. Certainly, if somebody, as we know from the book of 1 John, certainly somebody, if they've made a profession of faith and they've even been baptized, but then ultimately, as they grow into adulthood, walk away from God and ultimately live in a state of continual rebellion against God and don't desire the things of God, it's pretty clear that that profession was a false one in the beginning. And I don't think we should be all too afraid to say that. Ultimately, God is the discerner of the hearts of man, but we shouldn't be too afraid of saying, look, if somebody's living in constant rebellion and disobedience to God, then obviously the profession that maybe they had as a child or sometime before that wasn't altogether genuine. But we're seeing something like this, a breakdown of generational continuity. And I think that the family is the place to start when we talk about this, as far as how can we fix this. Again, much can be said about the church and her role in this particular breakdown, her programming, the material that she offers, etc. But I think first we'll talk about the home and family worship. And I want to do a series of videos really dealing with family worship. And I've got a study that begins in 1 Samuel, and I think in looking at the contrast between Samuel and Hophni and Phinehas, Eli's sons, we can see the difference between two different spiritual trajectories. So we'll look at that next time. But right now, I just want to give something of a primer looking forward to this series on family worship. I want to do what I can to keep it short, to keep it simple, to keep it biblical, and to keep a very helpful outline. So we'll look at some introductory matters, look at a couple of introductory texts, and then ultimately I want to look at family worship, family worship as a spiritual discipline, family worship as a time of teaching, family worship as a time of training, family worship as a time of discipleship and disciple making, family worship as a time of obedience, obedience specifically on the part of the father as a priest of the home, family worship as modeling the Christ life. And this is where we'll talk about kind of that generational legacy. Through the scriptures, we see that God deals through families. He deals to the church. The church is the center of the Christian life. It's the locus of spirituality. However, we see much, specifically in the family of David, we see much through the family line of God working. And we want to see a return to this family legacy of serving God. So I want to have a bigger vision of passing on the gospel to our children. Also want to look at family worship as submission on the father's part. Hey, you could go out in the garage, you could go get on the internet, you could get on the television, you could do any number of things other than submit to the needs of your family, and that is to lead them biblically and to train them in the things of God. We'll look at family worship as love, as simply loving God and as loving your family. And finally, we'll look at family worship as evangelism. I've said it often. We have this phenomenon in the modern church where children are not discipled in the home, and so they come to this point where they begin to ask questions. And I've said it's something like that little thermometer in a turkey baster on Thanksgiving, that when the end pops out, you know that it's ready. Sometimes children will come to their parents and they'll say they've got questions now, and we'll look at those children as we would a thermometer in a turkey baster and said, oh, it's ready. I need to get this thing out of the oven. And so we'll have a pastor come to get spirits of that child out of the oven, or walk through some sort of a sinner's prayer or something like this. But ultimately, if a child has questions, I think the first thing we need to conclude is that someone needs to give that child answers. And those answers are the gospel. And we'll see in the Bible there's a pattern. In Timothy's life specifically, Paul commends him for that and reminds him of his grandmother and his mother, and how they continually taught him the scriptures and they made him wise unto salvation. So we'll talk about that kind of generational legacy, but specifically we'll look at family worship as evangelism. It's a great place to be sharing the gospel in the home. That's where it begins. So we'll begin here with a video about 1 Samuel and looking at those contrasts.